Rich pointed out, I'm fairly new, been here for about a month and a half, but I've been around long enough to realize that I'm standing between you and lunch, which is at 12:15. So we will be done by 12:15. Especially, I think Michael said there was cheesecake and prime rib. So we'll get through this. I like this to be informal, so if you got questions, comments throughout here, please stop, and we'll just address it then. As Rich pointed out, I've spent the previous 9 years at Colorado State University teaching ag marketing, farm management, and production economics. And I had a pretty big, heavy research appointment where most of my research was on animal health. So back in April, right when I decided to come back to Manhattan, K-State, Rich asked, hey, we want you to be part of this, to start to meet people, start to see some of the state, and I said absolutely. He asked for a title. Wasn't sure exactly what I was getting myself into at that point, so I just gave him this title, thinking, oh, I'll come back later once I get here, revisit that title and figure it out. But forgot all about it until about 2 weeks ago when he said, hey, we need your slides. At that point, I started thinking through what I was even going to talk about, and immediately I thought, what can I possibly say about animal health that a lender would even care about? So I started thinking more about this, a little bit about this, and so as you're going to see throughout this talk, what I'm going to challenge you just to think about is, do you have a role in an animal disease outbreak, an animal health outbreak? Do you have a role in prevention? Or even during the outbreaks? That's some of the things we want to talk about as we go through these next 40 minutes. I'm not going to bore you with statistics. You guys are probably aware of these statistics that come from the Department of Ag, Kansas Department of Ag. Why I put these here is I want you to, you guys also know that the livestock industry is important, the feed and grain industry is important in Kansas, but I want you to think about the importance of these industries in terms of animal health. And you're going to see as we go along throughout this, it's going to come back, I think, for maybe some of the clients you work with. Animal health. We've had some recent animal health events throughout the United States. Those first three listed here are more regional or even local or maybe even at the state level. You got brucellosis up in the Yellowstone region, trick, VS, which was announced last week in Nebraska and Wyoming. Colorado's had this recently as well. These events aren't necessarily probably grab the main news outlets, but they do impose costs on producers, whether it's additional testing before you have to ship some livestock. That second bullet there, that PEDV in swine, 2013-14, probably more familiar with that. That's a little larger scale, had some impacts on a lot of producers. These bottom few here. Now we're going to talk more at the global, the world region. Foot and mouth disease. Probably have heard of that term before. We're going to spend some time at the end of this slide, or at the end of this presentation, just coming back talking about FMD specifically, and classical swine fever. Those two particular diseases, highly contagious. They can wipe out entire livestock sectors in other countries, and they have. These bottom two, high path AI, which again I said it's a world disease, but actually we had that here in the United States this past spring. And in fact, we had it here in Kansas, and we'll talk about that here in the next couple slides. Rift Valley fever. Rift Valley fever. Probably haven't heard of that particular disease. Actually, it's in the Rift Valley region, Eastern Africa, and then also in Saudi Arabia. I've got a couple slides I want to talk about that, just point out a couple things. But these two particular diseases here, these are what they call zoonotic, or they can be zoonotic. It can be zoonotic. Zoonotic is, it transmits from humans, or from livestock, animals, to humans. Now why is that important? I think that adds another level of complexity, or another source of some economic impacts to a producers. If we start having cattle or chickens who show up with certain diseases that humans start to get. I think we can talk about, was it swine flu? Although it really had any impact in humans, but consumers think that, then you have some demand issues, which Glenn might talk about later today. High-path AI, last December, state of Washington, where it showed up initially, because of the migratory birds that were flying, lasted 6 months. Last June this year, 223 cases were ultimately detected. About 48 million birds were depopulated. Mostly the egg industry, the laying hens, with Iowa and Minnesota taking a brunt of that. Now, why is that relevant? Why did I even talk about this? Well, because you notice Kansas here is green, and so got some information from the Kansas Department of Ag. Justin Smith shared with me that in early, I guess it was maybe late March, there was a flock, a small backyard flock of I think 10 birds, tested positive. Immediately, within any disease outbreak, they set up quarantine surveillance zones. Because this is a backyard flock, and you think about the traceability of somebody who might have one turkey in their backyard, kind of as a pet, or maybe 3 chickens. They didn't know where all these birds were, so they had to survey and talk to 10,000 premises. So they went knocking door to door asking, do you have any birds in your backyard? Which a lot of times, no, but my neighbor does. Ultimately, 143 premises, of those 10,000 they had to check, had birds in their backyard. 62 of those were tested. Quarantine movement restrictions were in place for 21 days. Again, I think that's important, as you'll see on this next slide. If you working with a producer, maybe it has a cattle operation, it's a quarantine and they can't move for days, weeks, months. That could start to cause some issues, maybe business continuity issues. There was also, that was a high path. Also this spring there was a low path out in southeast Kansas, down in the southeast part of the state. Turkey barn. My understanding it was just they were getting ready to ship a bunch of, about 12,000 turkeys to the processing plant across the border in Missouri. And that's when they detected that they had low path AI. Well, Missouri wouldn't let them ship them across the border. So they had to take out that entire flock of about 56,000 birds. And so we've had both high path and low path here in Kansas within the last 5-6 months. This is just a figure I got from Justin there at KDA. Specifically, I think this was used in the Minnesota high path case. So anytime, again, there's a disease outbreak, they start setting up different kinds of zones. So you start off with your infected premises there. Anything within, in this particular case, 3 kilometers. They call that the infected zone. I'm guessing anything in this zone did not move out, in or out. So if you had eggs that were in that zone, typically a farm can store eggs for about, they got enough capacity for a couple days, refrigerator space for 2 to 3 days. What happens if this lasts for several weeks? What do you start doing with all those extra eggs? And then you've got another zone around that, the buffer zone, a little more, probably still restrictive. There's still going to be a lot of movement restrictions, maybe a little more lenient. And then got a surveillance zone around that. Again, there's still a lot of active surveillance taking place. There's probably still movement restrictions going in and out. But the point of this is, if you have a producer that you're working with that might be falling in one of these, think about those additional costs that they will incur as this outbreak was to unfold. Think about the business continuity. If it's a dairy farmer with milk and you only have so much on-site storage, or an egg producer, or whatever it might be. But there is a lot of business continuity issues that could be surrounding this. Economic impacts, we talk about diseases. First thing I think about, of course, is the economic component of it. And then there's several sources of economic components, I think. We can talk about if you have to depopulate 48 million birds, you got a supply shift. There's going to be less eggs available. That's one source of that. We'll come back and talk about the other ones here in a second. Rift Valley fever, I mentioned this before. This is a zoonotic disease, so it infects humans, but it also impacts producers. Now, it's studied in Africa, it occurs in Africa, so why would we care to even think about this here in the United States? Any guesses why we might care to think about a disease like this? It's in Africa, here in the United States.
People travel, did it go back from humans to the...
People travel, absolutely. Every year, if you take a look at the statistics, people that come to the United States from overseas is going up. We're setting records almost every year. People leaving the United States for vacation or business or whatever, coming back, increases every single year. That's one. Anything else? Everything's global trade is going up all the time. Globalization, absolutely. Anything else? Any other guesses why we might care? Well, it's not here in the United States yet. And I don't want to get into politics or anything, but right over, if we had a window here, you could see a new building that's going up on campus, National Bioag Defense Facility. This will be one of about 8 diseases they will study there. Another one would be classical swine fever, which we talked about. Foot and mouth would be another one. And there's a few others. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to get out. That's not where I'm going with it. I'm just saying that these are things we want to think about. So, Rift Valley, it is zoonotic, so there are a human health component to this. We talk about morbidity. People get sick. People might die. And so there are costs associated with that. And I think there are also other costs if people start getting sick and dying because if it is related to maybe cattle, beef, people might start eating less beef. They could, depending on what kind of information is available. There are some other sources of costs associated. Government's going to have, the surveillance. So we showed you that zone, I think, on the previous slide or two. Well, they're going to have state police. They're going to have sheriffs manning those roads to make sure people can't get in and out. And if it's bad enough, they'll bring in the National Guard to set up these surveillance zones. So the government will definitely have incurred costs. Tourism. We saw in some outbreaks in different parts of the country, when you shut down, you can't travel. You're going to lose some tourism, lodging, travel, food, etc. So if there was an outbreak, let's say here in Manhattan, on a Friday afternoon, right before, OU comes to town. Think about all the impact that the town of Manhattan would lose. So that's another source that we tend to think about a little bit. But what I really want to focus on is just this component, this agriculture. Where we talk about production shocks, we can talk about consumer demand, and equally important, if not maybe a little more important, international trade. If we want to think about just foot and mouth disease or some other disease that isn't human health related, we'll just not think about this and we'll focus on these. So production shocks. If we depopulate a bunch of birds or maybe a bunch of cows, pigs, etc., there's a supply shock. We're gonna have less supply. But then there's also a consumer response, consumer demand response. And it turns out in a lot of these modeling exercises, what people do and study, consumer demand matters. It is important. If they stop eating beef or poultry or whatever it is, those prices will trickle back down to the producer level. There has been some work that looked at food safety outbreaks, so slightly different, but food safety here in the United States. Outside the U.S., there's been some animal health major events. People have studied them. What they all tend to find is they're small. The consumer demands shocks. The consumers maybe stop eating that beef for just a relatively short amount of time. And it's not a lot, typically. So maybe it's not quite as important as we think it is, but it still is it will have an impact on those prices that producers receive. International trade. This is generally a really big concern issue. We think about a disease. When it hits, it spreads. It spreads and spreads. How fast does it spread? How far does it spread? How many animals become impacted? Those are very important when we start thinking about international trade because we lose export markets. 2003, right at the end of 2003, in December 2003, we had that dairy cow up in the state of Washington that had BSE. And thinking about the export recovery markets there, here's a figure taken from a Livestock Marketing Information Center based out of Denver. And what we have is the U.S. beef and veal exports as a percent of total U.S. production. So in 2003, you can see, 10% roughly of U.S. beef that was produced in the United States was exported. Then we go to the end of 2003, we have that BSE case, that single event. We drop down there to less than 2%. And we've slowly, gradually built back up. I think this afternoon, Glenn Tonser, when he does kind of the outlook talk on the livestock side, you probably will see this chart again, and you'll probably talk about international trade and how that relates back to producer prices. There has been some really big foot and mouth disease outbreaks. I think one in 2001 is a really big one that pictures on the nightly news every night on NBC, CBS, saw mounds, piles of burning carcasses. Again, I think that has impacts on consumer demand, but it was a really big outbreak in this particular case. It took them a long time to get market access, to even get access to the international markets. However, right across the channel in 2001, that same outbreak, Netherlands contracted FMD. Now, they only had 3 cases. So they were actually able to get their access market, international export markets back open within 2 months. They were same amount of exports before. So I think, it depends on the size of the markets, the historical relationships with those particular those markets. But generally speaking, we can go back and just take a look at this figure here on the previous slide, or on the export markets. Disease outbreaks do matter. We have a scheduled scan for Tourette's. Which just happened yesterday at the same time at 12 o'clock, or close to 12. Oh, there we go. So now I want to talk you through a couple slides. I want to focus on a specific disease, foot and mouth disease. There's been a lot of effort by Kansas Department of Ag working with feedlots, dairies, swine operations, etc., on trying to prepare, trying to train in the event of a foreign animal disease, such as foot and mouth disease. Why do we always focus on foot and mouth? Why is there a lot of discussion on foot and mouth? It's kind of the big disease that can spread really fast. It's probably the disease that has the most economic importance in terms of animal diseases. And if we can control, or if we can train for something, the big one, then everything else should seem, in theory, a little easier. There's been several studies that have come out recently that have said if we have a foot and mouth disease outbreak, it can cost well over $100 billion. Thinking back to those slides before, talked about loss of tourism, talked about government costs to eradicate and clean up, but also a loss to the producers and the consumers. And so $100 billion, some of those recent studies, but what these recent studies have all concluded is what we've got highlighted there in red. The strategies that are employed by animal health officials can have significant impacts on how many animals are culled or depopulated, how fast, how far it spreads, and how long these outbreaks last, which then all turn back to, I'm going to argue, different economic drivers. Probably, will consumers stop or eating a particular product, and how long will that last? How fast can we open up our international export markets? And how many animals are we going to have to depopulate because of this? And so I've also put this in red because, again, I want you to think through or think about, I've said animal health officials, the strategies they employ will help, can help eradicate or control a disease, but is there anything that maybe as a lender you can do to maybe help try to mitigate a disease? I don't know the answer, but I just want to plant that seed and think about it. We'll come back here in a little bit and talk about that. Background, foot and mouth. Again, it's going to be studied just right across the street here. It is highly contagious. It impacts cattle, swine, sheep, goats, etc. It spreads really fast. It spreads direct to contact. So animals come in direct contact, indirect. So if a feed truck was to come and drop some feed off at my place, then it was to pick up the disease on the tires and maybe go to the next farm. You could spread it that way. In fact, in 2007, there was a FMD outbreak in the UK. And if you read the government reports, at least, there was a facility that studied FMD, so something like what's being built here. One of the workers dropped the vaccine down the wrong drain, so it went outside, a tree, roots, broke the pipe, water, it was raining, wet season, came up, somebody picked up a truck through the mud, carried it down the road to a swine farm, and that's how it started. Okay? That's the government version if you read the reports. Now, if you go and visit and talk with people over there, a lot of them tend to think it was a disgruntled employee. Again, so it can happen. In addition to the indirect, also wind. So it will spread via wind as well. And so that's, again, why it can spread so fast and get so far, so fast. The last known FMD outbreak in the mainland here in the United States was in 1929 in California, so it's been a long time. We have not had any here since then. But this is a global animal threat. Again, we talked about globalization. We talked about international visitors coming and going. We talk about trade. 2009, 38 countries notified the World Animal Health Organization that they had FMD outbreak. There's been several severe FMD outbreaks across time. One of the more recent, South Korea, 2011, started in 11. They concluded, they eradicated in 2012. I think a third, 32%, 31% of their entire swine population was depopulated or removed. A couple years ago now, a colleague of mine, Ted Schroeder, and an individual in the vet school, Mike Sanderson, who's a veterinary epidemiologist, and one of his PhD students. We started out, we wanted to look at an FMD outbreak, but more specifically, we were focused on continuity of business. So if you have to quarantine a feedlot, for example, for days, weeks, maybe months, how is that going to impact the business itself? And so we were really interested in that, and so we embarked on this study where we really were estimating the economic impacts to producers, consumers, the government, looking at different control strategies. How can we control this and eradicate it? Specifically related to vaccination. Why vaccination? Well, recently I think the USDA has realized that we can't go in and just kill everything like they've always wanted to back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Some of these feedlots, when you might have 70, 80,000 head, we just can't go depopulate an entire feedlot overnight. And then the next one down the road, the same thing. So vaccination is now, I think, a possibility we might start looking at. The problem with vaccination is we run into other issues related to international trade. So if we start vaccinating, you can't tell the difference between a vaccinated animal and an animal that actually contracts it without the vaccination. So we actually could lose international trade longer. But anyway, we wanted to focus on just looking at the economic impacts. Since earlier we talked about studies that, the $100 billion plus potential economic impacts from these foot and mouth disease outbreaks. Well, this is one of those studies that estimated that. There are a few more slides that I removed from this presentation, primarily because I was afraid of time. I didn't want to get in front of between you and lunch. So in this model, we take this disease spread model, the veterinary epidemiologists, they figure out how fast and how far these diseases can spread, or this particular disease can spread, looking at different scenarios, different mitigation strategies. And so we're looking at the heart of the cattle feed. We got parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, I believe parts of Iowa, Wyoming, and Colorado. So the disease can spread far, it can spread where a lot of the cattle are. They determine the extent, the duration, the number of animals that become infected, how many animals would be depopulated, how many vaccinations would have to be administered, etc. They give that to the economists. We take that information, we develop economic models to where we can try to predict, try to forecast what would be the changes in prices, what would be the changes in quantities as a result of that information, losing international trade, what happens if consumers stop eating beef by a small percent for maybe a couple quarters, etc. And then we come up and we aggregate all that at that $100 billion plus, at that macro level. Well, what these models also have underneath them is the changes in prices. So then we pull out all those prices. And we took those prices, and what we did is we constructed just an enterprise budget. Net returns to a cow-calf operation. So we said, hey, let's build a representative cow-calf budget, and we'll calculate the net returns. And so underlying all this information are the changes in feeder cattle prices, change in grain prices, corn, forage. There's pasture built into this, pasture prices. Because in the event of an outbreak and we have to remove a whole bunch of cattle, well, now all of a sudden the demand for corn is going to go down. So there will be changes in prices of your feedstuffs, in addition to the livestock. So we got two columns here. This is a baseline if we did not have an FMD outbreak. And so year one is 2009, 2010, 11, 12, and 13. These first 2 years are historical data coming from the USDA. And so this $62 a head loss, that is actually what happened in that year. These bottom three are all just forecasts. So every year the USDA puts out their projections for the next 10 years. And so this is, if we don't have FMD, well, we already know what happened here, but then the USDA projects all these different corn, pasture, cattle, et cetera, prices, and we construct some budgets. Well, then we go in and we build the same model, the same budgets, but we're using different prices if we had an FMD outbreak that we were. And what I want to just point out here is $62 a head of what actually occurred, but if we were to have a potential FMD outbreak, there could be some significant losses per head. And so thinking about this maybe from your standpoint is if you have producers that you're working with, cattle, what could you do? Maybe there's nothing, but what if we had this outbreak? So, question and answers. We've got 11, 12 minutes. We're going to do this a little different, though. Since we're on campus, questions, I get asked the questions, you get to provide the answers. When we're in the classroom, we typically think of this as a pop quiz. And so Rich probably never told you we were having a pop quiz. And those that pass get to eat the prime rib and the cheesecake. Those that don't, well, we're sorry. We got beans out this way, he says. So, a couple questions for you guys that I don't know the answers. I just would like to get your thoughts or comments. Is there anything as a lender, is there anything that you could do to help maybe mitigate a potential foreign animal disease outbreak? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And if so, what might that be? Any thoughts? Is there anything that you can do as a lender, working with some of your producers? Oh, yeah.
You can supply information of what animals you know your customers have and the location that they have.
So, yeah, in since we don't necessarily have a developed animal identification traceability system like some other countries do, if you know, you can provide that maybe to animal health officials, and they can get there faster to track and make sure, okay, they are clean. We're going to keep them. You're in the maybe a safe zone, if you will. So that's one way, thinking about the traceability. Any other thoughts, comments? One thing I was thinking about when I pulled all this together was, what about maybe biosecurity measures? Maybe you can talk with your producers. So have you thought about different biosecurity measures? What are you doing in case to help maybe mitigate a potential outbreak? Do you have people coming on your farms that are maybe coming from other farms? Or maybe you have international visitors that are here to look at farms in the United States and they just walk right on. Do you know where they're coming from? Have they been from countries that have diseases? Maybe foot and mouth disease. That's just one other example I maybe was thinking about that could possibly. Second question, if a producer is directly impacted with the foreign animal disease. So now you're working, your producer impacted, either maybe it's depopulated, his animals are depopulated, or maybe he's in that quarantine zone and he can't ship anything out. Maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months. Is there anything that you can do to help him? Again, I don't know the answer. Any thoughts on that?
You hope he has a lot of equity.
You hope he has a lot of equity, yeah? Yep.
If you're close to retirement, you just leave.
Are there any other questions that maybe I should be thinking about that I didn't ask you guys? Is there some other things that are out there that maybe worry you guys? And again, from an animal health perspective.
So if you have an outbreak and you've got a producer who has this and they have to, like your word, depopulate their herd, is there any kind of assistance payment that happens after that?
There is. And so if you have a herd that is quarantined and depopulated, not just quarantined, because if the government removes them, they will pay market value.
What kind of timeline does that take to see the money?
So I guess the recent outbreak is with these high path, right? And when I say market value, typically they go back before the outbreak, because you can imagine, right, when you have the outbreak, the market's going to be worth nothing. So they go back. There are some issues, though, with that as well. If you go back, if there's not a market in the area. I remember brucellosis. There was a producer, his herd got depopulated. There wasn't necessarily, he didn't think he was getting the fair market value, so went back and forth. Timelines, I'm guessing with anything with the government, it's really fast.
Yeah.
No, that said, this last outbreak, they hired a whole bunch of, so I lived in Fort Collins during this outbreak. Well, Fort Collins is where the USDA APHIS has an office. In fact, they have the indemnification specialist there in Fort Collins, and I know they hired some other people to help speed that process up because they wanted to get that money back out pretty fast. So in the past, maybe it has been a little slower, but I don't know that we've had real big outbreaks like we had recently. But I think they hired a few extras to help get that. And they made some comments. They learned a lot in that process because they're projecting this fall they could have another outbreak like the one in the spring, and that's going to start any time now with the birds that are starting to migrate. Yeah.
Depending on the disease, is there a time lag before the producer can get back into production on that property?
Yes, it's going to be very disease specific. So the low path here in Kansas, the turkey barns, I think they had to keep them after they depopulated. Of course, then you had to depopulate all the animals. And you had to bury them, which I think they buried them on site, if I'm not mistaken. So that's going to take time to get to that point. Well, then I think they were inactive for 60 days. So it's not only are your animals maybe quarantined, thinking about this business continuity aspect or idea, you might have to depopulate, but then there's an extended where you can't bring animals back in. But then it takes time to rebuild the herds. That's even going to be an extended. Now that, I would argue, is probably the bigger issue from a producer standpoint, and I don't know that there's assistance for that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
You know, we're familiar with this somewhat in the pork industry. You hear guys repopping, but typically that's what, what's the word you used, zoonotic? What was the term?
Zoonotic.
Zoonotic.
Yep.
So many of those things, like pets and other things, I suppose, probably wasn't any, I don't think they were forced to, it was just an
Right.
economic decision. You gotta
Yep.
get out, you're
Yep.
done.
Mm-hmm.
So those guys stand that, I guess, typically. I can think of one guy I've watched do that, I suppose, 3 times over 15 years, for different reasons. I guess they just stand that.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a whole different, look at the cattle industry, it's a whole different.
Yeah, no, that's
situation.
exactly. Think about the birds. You know, you've got birds that turn over pretty fast. You can bring those back in and get them going, but with the cattle, it's a lot different. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Is there a way to check, like, I know just other than like the regular coffee shop conversation, but a way of mitigating risk is figuring out adjacent landowners, like I think in terms of crops too, how they manage their livestock and that as well to kind of tell, see what vaccinations they're using and kind of play off of that and the management systems, how they're disposing of certain things and.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. I think with the most recent trick going around the state, I think they're trying to get something passed in legislature that would, you need to notify your immediate neighbors that you have it. So I don't know that's for all diseases, but I think that's in the talks, if it's not already in the works. I know they've been talking about how you have to notify your immediate neighbors if you have it. That way they're aware of it. But no, that's a really good point. Now, if it's highly contagious, you're going to have police cars and probably blocking off your road, so that might be a little more obvious. But there's not been a lot of talk. I've never really heard too much discussion around notification of neighbors, except for when I was meeting with folks over at the KDA recently. They talked about that specifically with trick, how you have to notify your neighbors if you have it. But no, that's a good comment, something to think about.
Going back to one of your earlier slides, how come only 60 out of the 140 were tested?
That I'm not sure. I don't know all the ins and outs of that particular outbreak. So Justin, the Deputy Commissioner for Animal Health, gave me some slides, and maybe those were the ones that they felt provided the biggest risk. So maybe if you have one that had it, but yet they're the next county over, maybe they're 20 miles away, and they have no contact with anybody else, that maybe it's just a low risk. But what's interesting is of course, it's a backyard operation. They didn't know who, where. They had to go test or survey, I guess they call them 10,000 operations, which meant knocking door to door on 10,000 operations.
Did they ever find the source?
I don't know if they ever did. I suspect it's probably just a wild bird would be my guess. Yeah. Other questions? We've got 2 more minutes before I'm cutting myself off. No other questions? Well, thank you very much. If you got questions anytime, I think all these slides will be posted on our Ag Manager website. Oh, okay, never mind. Wow, Rich is pretty fast. Thank you.